Well, hello again. I'm Barratt, and I'm here to take you through another teaching of the online Bible school, the 6-day Bible school. All the studies are taken from this first book in Module 1. Will the real Christians please stand up? You can order it from www.barrattministries.org.uk. Just go to the bookshop, and there's many books that we've written on that website. But the study tonight is from this first book. We're up to study number 8, and it's the third in a little, 3 little studies I've taken from Matthew chapter 16 and verse 24. Jesus said unto his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him first deny himself, 2, take up his cross, and thirdly, follow me. So there's a progression here. You can't take up your cross before you've denied yourself. And if you think you're following Jesus and you haven't denied self and taken up your cross, then you must be deceived, because Jesus is telling us the order. If you want to come after me, this is the order. Well, we've looked at denying self, and we said that's to do with separation from the world. It's denying what you want, and that would include status and all sorts of things. We've looked at it. And then the last study we looked up, take up your cross. And we saw this wasn't living separately than the world. It wasn't denying self. It was crucifying the flesh, the old nature of Adam. And we saw that only God can do that when we give him the rights. In the first study I looked at 3 things: the world, the flesh and the devil. So denying yourself is to do with the world, being separate from the world. Taking up your cross is to do with being crucified, and that's the flesh life, the old Adam, that old nature. And the devil, the world, the flesh and the devil. So I'm going to argue that this third one is a natural consequence. Follow me is to destroy the works of the devil. Let me read you a scripture from the Epistle of John, first epistle of St. John, chapter 3 and verse 8. It's the second part of the verse I'm interested in. It says, he that committeth sin is of the devil, for the devil sinneth from the beginning. And this is the part I want to look at. For this purpose the Son of God was manifested. So he was revealed to the earth, because he was a carpenter. He wasn't manifested until he started preaching the gospel of the kingdom. For this purpose the Son of God was manifested, that he may destroy the works of the devil. So I think we need to ask, what are the works of the devil? Is it to make people sick? Is it to make people sin? Is it to make people angry? Rebellious? Well, it's not difficult to fit everything that you may think the devil does if we get the one premise. And the aim of Satan from the Garden of Eden is to separate man from God. Because that's what he achieved. It wasn't to get Eve to eat the fruit. It wasn't to get her to disobey God. The disobedience was a means to an end for the devil. He knew that when Eve disobeyed God, God would cut Adam and Eve off from the tree of life. He would now be exiled in heaven. In the garden, God came down in the cool of the day and talked to Adam and Eve. They could look at him. They didn't know they were naked. God could look at them. But as soon as they sinned, God exiled himself. God's now in heaven. He doesn't walk on the earth. We couldn't stand it. It'd kill us. And he achieved his objective. So it wasn't to get Eve to sin. It was to separate man from God. The sin was the means. If eating bananas would separate us from God, the devil would get us eating bananas. But actually, disobedience to God is what cuts us off, what loses our rebellion. Obedience, on the other hand, just as a matter of interest, is how we're reconciled to God and how we grow like God and how we become a friend of God through obedience, because faith is linked to obedience. Abram's faith is obedience, and his faith made him the friend of God. So that's Satan's job, to separate. Let's just stop there. Because if he separates man from God, the consequences are he'll separate a man from his wife. He'll separate a father from the child. He'll separate boss from workers, pastors from congregation. The devil's fundamental job is to separate, break up families, break up the relationship between man and God, between man and wife, between man and man. So the sinning and all the other things, that's a means to an end. The end is separation. So if Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil, then it's easy to see what Jesus came to do. It wasn't to forgive sins, that was a means to an end. The end was to reconcile man back to God, undo the devil's work, destroy what the devil had done. So to destroy it, he undid it. So Jesus reconciled man to God. And the Bible says he's given us this spirit of reconciliation. So I believe when I teach, husbands and wives should be reconciled if they've got problems. Fathers and children, mothers and children should be reconciled. Pastors and congregations should be reconciled, because that's the ministry he's given us. Your ministry should reconcile people. If your ministry splits people up, you've got a problem. Because that's the ministry, that's undoing the works of the devil. The devil's job is to separate, to cause division. And Jesus came to undo that work. And instead of division, he came to create oneness, unity between man and God. Well, there's lots of scriptures that talk about reconciliation. It's outside this study, but I'm sure you'll accept that. So the world, the flesh and the devil. We've got to destroy the works of the devil. We've got to reconcile men back to God. Of course, we also destroy the means that he uses, because he uses sickness, he uses sin. So that's why Jesus says, go and cast out devils, heal the sick, raise the dead. It's only a means to reconcile men to God. Because once a man's healed, I can say, well, the power of God did that. Jesus died for you. It's a way, a means to reconcile people to God. It's not healing people for healing's sake. There's always a motive. Because as well as the ministry of healing, casting out devils, etc., there was the other mandate, preach the gospel of the kingdom. So they go together. Let's read St. Luke. The Gospel of St. Luke in chapter 4. Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil, to reconcile us. And we'll never do that. You'll never have that ministry of reconciliation. You'll never be a true follower unless you first denied self and taken up your cross. How can I help somebody's marriage if I've got a marriage problem? How can I get somebody to be reconciled to God if I'm not reconciled to God? How can I teach somebody to be a friend of God if I've not become a friend of God? We teach by example, not just by knowledge. Our doctrine should be our lifestyle, because people learn by observation much more than what you tell them. It's true of children, isn't it? What you tell them is good, but they follow what you do. You're the role model for a child. And so a man of God, a Christian, is a role model for other people. So I've got to get my act together. I've got to get my marriage on a good footing to help people with problems. I've got to make sure that I've got a good relationship with God, so I can point people to what a good relationship with God is. And so it goes down the line. In every area, I've got to live the life. That's the hard thing. That's discipleship. Thinking like Jesus, so that you can reconcile people to God. So Luke chapter 4. Verse 18. This is what Jesus said. quoting from Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me. He's chosen of God for his purpose. He's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted. That's restoration. That's coming to unity again. If your heart's broken, it's not united, it's splintered. Heal the brokenhearted, preach deliverance to the captives, the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. That's why Jesus came. To heal the brokenhearted, to open the prison doors, to restore. Well, this is a very nice study for me because I'm not challenging you with anything. I'm going to use 3 examples of people in the Bible. Because God listens to people who've left the world and crucifies the flesh. He also commissions them for work. Let me repeat that. God listens to people. If you want God to answer your prayers, you need to go through this process, because God listens to people who've left the world, denied themselves, crucified the flesh, and he also commissions them for work. Follow me is a natural consequence. I'm not going to teach anything about following Jesus, because when you've denied self, taken up your cross, it's an automatic consequence. God will listen to you and he'll commission you. So, we've got 3 people to look at. I'm going to look at Moses. I'm going to look at Daniel. I'm going to look at Jesus. Maybe Jesus is a funny example. Did Jesus have to deny himself and take up his cross before he was crucified? Yes, he did. I'm going to show you. First of all, Moses. I'm going to read from Acts chapter 7. Well, if ever there was a man in the world, it was Moses. Egypt's a type of the world in the Bible. When you go to Bible college, they tell you Egypt's a type of the world. Pharaoh's a type of Satan. So how can you be more worldly than Moses in type? It was actually Satan's son of Pharaoh, brought up. So how can you be more worldly than that? In Egypt, a type of the world, and brought up in Satan's palace, Pharaoh, a type of Satan. So how more can you be worldly? What a wonderful example. He was taken out of Israel, they were in Egypt, but he was taken out of God's people and put in Satan's palace, Pharaoh's palace. What do you think about that? That's amazing. So here's a good example. Can God use a man so much in the world? Of course he can. If you're called, if you're predestined. So he worked hard in the world. He was rising up to prominence in Egypt. It tells us, Acts chapter 7. And verse 20. In which time Moses was born and was exceedingly fair, good-looking child, healthy, robust child, and nourished up in his father's house for 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him and nourished him for her own son. So Pharaoh's daughter's son, so not really Pharaoh's son, but that would be Pharaoh's grandson, wouldn't it? But it's the same thing in Pharaoh's past. And Moses was learning all the wisdom of Egypt. So he grew up with all the wisdom of Egypt. So he would learn all about the occult of Egypt. They worshipped Ra and the serpent, and he would learn all the mysteries of Egypt. He would learn the protocols of how to be a diplomat. He rose up in the world. But you know what happened? God used circumstances. He had to leave Egypt. If you don't know the story, I'm sure many of you do, but if you've not been a Christian very long, I'll tell you the story. God's people Israel were under Egypt, and they were slaves, and they were very hard taskmasters. And one day, Moses was walking through the lands, and he saw an Egyptian beating an Israeli. And he fought him off, and he killed the Egyptian, and he buried him in the sand. Thought nobody had seen it. But of course the Israeli knew, and some Egyptians had seen it as well. Anyway, a few days later, Moses is... Well, no, I'm not saying the Egyptians had seen it. But this man must have told people. Anyway, the next day, or the next few days later, Moses is walking through and he sees two Israelis arguing. And he says, you shouldn't be arguing. What are you arguing for? And one of them said, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And Moses suddenly realised that people knew that he'd killed an Egyptian. And he knew his life would be in danger. Of course, God knew all this, God arranged it. But he fled Egypt. He decided to flee Egypt. And so he ran away. It was a conscious decision. Let me read it. He could have stayed. But this is what it says, Hebrews 11, verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God. So it was a choice. He chose to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. So he could have stayed in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. He didn't fear that the king might come after him. He'd made his decision, I'm going to suffer with my own people, as seeing him who is invisible. All right. Moses has fled Egypt. He's left the world. It was a choice. He suffered, he chose to go with God's people. He denied himself. He could have had all the treasures and pleasures of Egypt of sin, but he chose to suffer with his people. And so he fled Egypt. He identified with God's people. He denied himself and left Egypt. Well, had he destroyed the works of the devil? Not really. He'd kill one Egyptian, save one Israeli. So it's like casting one devil out and maybe winning one convert, I don't know. But he'd done very little. You see, how can you have an effect when you're still in the world? Moses could not deliver Egypt while he was in Egypt. This is very important. All he could do was free one Israeli and kill one Egyptian. And that's what's happened. Because the church is so worldly, they can't affect the world. The church are not affecting the world. In fact, the world is affecting the church. Churches are becoming entertainment centres. Churches are becoming social clubs and doing social work instead of preaching the powerful gospel of Christ and raising the dead and healing the sick and casting out devils. It's all friendship evangelism, which isn't evangelism. It's not part of the gospel. You've got to open your mouth and preach the truth. Not give people sugar. And the church have no effect on Mr. and Mrs. Nice. Often we get converts, but it's because they'd be so battered by Satan that they fall in the church. They're on drugs, or they've had a divorce or a disaster, or they've gone bankrupt and they turn to God. So the devil's battered them so much, he's overplayed his hand and he's pushed them to God. But what about Mr. and Mrs. Nice? They don't need God. They say, why do I need God? I don't need all that nonsense. I've got a good job. I've got a wife who loves me. I've got 3 children. We have a holiday every year. We've got 2 cars. What do I want God for? I've got all the entertainment I want on television. I'm having a nice life. I don't want God. I'd like to get rid of the terrorists and I'd like the outside, but I've got a nice life. I don't need God. And we don't touch those people because the church is still in Egypt. We're offering them entertainment. Well, they've got that in the world. We're offering them social care, which is great, but they can get that from the world. What we've got that's different, we don't give them because we're frightened to offend people. Anyway, Moses couldn't deliver Israel out of Egypt because he was still in Egypt. So God had to get him out. So he left Egypt and he was in the desert. He was 40 years in Egypt, the Bible tells us. 40 years, an important number. David reigned 40 years. Saul reigned 40 years. Samuel was a prophet 40 years. Israel were 40 years in the wilderness. It's a great number. It's a time of testing. There's lots of other things we can attribute to 40. But it was 40 years in Egypt. And then he went into the wilderness. And it can't be by chance he was 40 years in the desert. And I believe this is where he was crucifying his flesh, where he was getting humbled, where his character was being changed. Because it took 40 years to put Egypt in him, and it's taking 40 years to get Egypt out. It's not by chance it's the same period. And so I believe after 40 years of being in the desert, he lost all confidence, he'd lost all the finery, the culture of Egypt. And God called him. He was 80, but he'd fulfilled the first two conditions. Amazing what happened. Amazing what happened. Let's read Exodus 4. Verse 10. I'm not going to talk about the burning bush. You know that God appeared to him in the burning bush. It wasn't consumed. And God told him that he was going to deliver Israel. He did the miracles for him. Verse 4 is showing us the miracles. So he turned the water into blood. He's put his hand in his bosom and taken out lepers. This has all happened. He's seen the power of God. He knows that God could do it. But Moses, verse 10, had no confidence. Don't you think that's amazing? God did all those miracles, and yet he had no confidence. And Moses said to the Lord, "Oh my Lord, I'm not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant. But I'm slow of speech and a slow tongue." No confidence. How can I talk to Pharaoh? And the Lord said to him, "Who's made man's mouth, or who maketh the dumb or the deaf, or the seeing or the blind? Have I not? Do I not make people dumb? Do I not give people speech?" And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. God was angry. Moses lacked faith here, didn't he? But you know, Moses became the meekest man on the earth. And this was part of the process. To lose confidence in the flesh. I've heard preachers say that Moses had an impediment. He found it hard to speak. But I'm going to disprove that. That's not true. It's nothing to do with his speech. It's his lack of confidence. He's been talking to sheep for 40 years in the backside of the desert. He's lost all his culture. He's lost all his eloquence. I mean, what do sheep say? Bah! You don't talk much to sheep, do you? You forget how to talk. I remember my wife working full-time for God. She worked a few years full-time for God, mixing with Christians, Christian conversations, and then she went back in the world to get a job. And she said, when people said things to me, I'd forgotten how to argue. My wife could argue. She was brought up in a family that argued. In fact, they didn't only argue, they threw things or punched each other. A very violent family. So her tongue was cutting. Her tongue was so sharp, she would cut anyone down to size. People used to call her the dragon. That's what they called her, because her tongue was so sharp. Thank God he's done a wonderful work on her now. They've not found a name for her yet, but as she is now. But that's what they used to call her. But she said, I've mixed with Christians so long and talked with Christians the language that I've forgotten how to argue. You can lose it, you know. You can lose your sharp tongue if you mix with the right people. On the other hand, if you're very eloquent and you mix with sheep or you mix with rough cursing people, it's easy to take on their language and become crude. But it doesn't matter. I've tried to convince you, but this scripture will convince you. I stopped short. We read the scripture, we read the verse, but I stopped short. It's in Acts chapter 7. I read verse 20. In which time Moses was born, was exceeding fair, nourished up in his father's house 3 months, and when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up, nourished him for her own son. Listen to this. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of Egypt, I'd read that, and was mighty in words and deeds. He was mighty in words, so he was a great orator. Of course, that's your training. Prince Charles doesn't seem to be tongue-tied when he's interviewed on television or when he meets the crowds. The royal family are trained to be diplomatic, to say the right thing, to know how to talk to people. And royalty, they can talk to people who are upper class. They can also talk to poor people. They know how to talk to them. And Moses was mighty in words and deeds. So you can't tell me that he wasn't eloquent when he fled Egypt. Lost all confidence in the flesh. I'm using this because this is what happens. When you're in the world, it's pride, it's self, it's status. But you see, when God deals with it, when he puts you in the desert and starts to crucify the flesh, you have no confidence in the flesh. You don't say, I'll do it. You say, if God wills, by God's grace. Your terminology changes because you've no confidence in the flesh. You know if God takes his hand off your life, you'll be the worst sinner on the planet. You've been exposed, you see your true self. You become meek and humble and hunger and thirst after righteousness. You become a peacemaker. You become merciful. All these qualities only come through the desert experience. And you can't get from Israel to the Canaan, to the promised land, without going through the desert. This is the process. Well, when he'd left the world, allowed his flesh to be crucified, this one man, who before when he was in the world killed one Egyptian, killed the whole Egyptian army. This one man, who when he was in Israel could only free one Israelite, this one man freed a whole nation. Can you see the enormity of what happened after he'd gone through the process? It's the same man who could only deliver one in Egypt, and now he delivered a whole nation. Don't you think that's fantastic? I think that's marvellous. What God can do. He didn't over deliver Israel, but the whole Egyptian army, that's if Pharaoh, Satan, that's all the demons, they were drowned in the sea. A tremendous victory, a whole deliverance. It's never happened before in world history where a nation's been delivered en masse. But one man did it, not an army that freed them. Even Jesus is going to free the world with the armies of heaven, but Moses did it without an army. Because God did it. He didn't need guns. God sent the plagues. But amazing. So can you see the difference? Moses left Egypt, he crucified the flesh in the desert, and he destroyed the works of the devil. He followed Christ. All right, let's look at number 2 example. Let's look at Daniel. It's different. Daniel was in Israel. He was a righteous man. But he found that he was taken captive as a young man to Babylon. When you're a Christian, God never puts you back in the world. Israel never went back to Egypt. When they backslid, God didn't send them to Egypt, he sent them to Babylon. Because Babylon is the counterfeit. They're still God's people, but now they're counterfeit. It's a difference between the bride and the whore. So Daniel chapter 1. Let's see how Daniel found himself in Babylon. Maybe I'll read from verse 5. And the king appointed them a daily portion of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they may stand before the king. Nebuchadnezzar believed that in 3 years he could change somebody from the thinking of God, the thinking of Israel, who had the feasts and the commandments and the moral laws of God. He felt in 3 years he could change that to the thinking of Babylon, with the temple prostitutes, when they're offering the children to demons, witchcraft, Satanism. He thought he could do it in 3 years. So they had the king's food, he nourished them, and they would learn the language, they would learn about the gods. In fact, they changed Daniel's name to Belteshazzar. Bel is one of the gods of Babylon. And he changed the name of the 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. But those were the names that they'd been changed to. And Daniel was already a very intelligent man. Could have been one of the king's sons. Verse 3 says, the king spake to Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes. So it is likely he was a prince of royalty, Daniel. And children in whom was no blemish, so that's physical. He was a fine specimen, no blemish. He wasn't squint, he didn't have a gammy leg, no problems. Well favoured, popular, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, and such as had ability to stand in the king's palace. So these were training for reigning. These were training to stand and rule Babylon for King Nebuchadnezzar. He took the intelligentsia, he took the creme de la creme of Israel, and he took them to Babylon to be of use to Babylon. You know, God's people have great use to Babylon. Did you know that? God's people who are saved and know God, if Satan can corrupt you and you become the whore instead of the bride, you're of great use, because God's people often are at the top of the whore, the counterfeit. Christians don't know the difference, but sometimes the top preachers in the world are actually part of the whore. They're of great use. All they need is corrupting, and 3 years can do it. Of course, Jesus took the disciples and trained them 3 years to get the mind of Christ. So 3 years, again, is a time of change. And the king appointed them provision of the daily meat. But Daniel decided, he purposed in his heart. Verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. I don't think for one moment that it was because it wasn't kosher meat. The Jews couldn't drink the blood with the meat. He was training to be a politician, a diplomat. He could have said to the head of the eunuchs, look, you know we're Jews, so will you drain the blood out of the meat? We want the quality meat, of course, but drain the blood out. They could have done that. That wasn't what was defiling. And it was the wine as well. I don't think there's any such thing as kosher wine, is there? Wine is wine. So why couldn't he eat the wine? No, they wanted to eat simple food. They didn't say, give us meat that we can eat. He said, we won't eat meat, we won't reach that rich food. We're in Babylon, we're God's people in Babylon. We want to live a humble life, we want to entreat God. And so they ate pulses, vegetables. I don't think they ate that for the whole time they was in Babylon. I think that was maybe for a period or for the 3 years, because they said, let's test us 10 days. And they tested them after 10 days. And Daniel and his 3 friends were actually brighter faced and healthier than all the others who'd had the king's meat. But it says he didn't eat meat at another time. He had a Daniel fast. He had no pleasant meat. So I'm not saying that was all the way through, but he was setting a precedent. I don't want to live like Babylon. Remember when the edict came, he prayed 3 times a day when he was forbidden. He lived this sacrificial lifestyle. He didn't live like the world. He didn't live like them. He denied himself because it was quite okay. It wasn't sinful to eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine, but he denied himself. He denied what his flesh would have liked. Of course he would in the king's palace. But he denied himself. And he crucified the flesh. Chapter 9, verse 3 of Daniel. I set my face unto the Lord God to seek by prayer and supplications with sackcloth and fasting and ashes. So he's living this life. He's giving God a legal right to change him. This is the Sermon on the Mount lifestyle. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, when you pray, when you fast, when you alms, God, not if you do. A Christian who doesn't fast, I don't know how they call themselves a Christian. It's the instructions of the man you're supposed to be following, Jesus. It's not an option. Fasting isn't an option for a Christian. He says when you fast, don't do it like the hypocrites. And so he's living this Sermon on the Mount lifestyle that will give God a right to change him. And what happened? Denied himself, crucified the flesh. He lived the Sermon on the Mount lifestyle. Tremendous what happened to Daniel. I don't know whether you realise how pivotal Daniel is in God's calendar. But verse 21 says, while I was yet speaking, he's praying, confessing his sin, the man Gabriel. This is the angel Gabriel that came to Mary. How many times does Gabriel come to people in the Bible? But Gabriel himself came to Daniel. That's amazing. The very one who pronounced the birth of Jesus to Mary. The man Gabriel, whom I'd seen in a vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me. And he informed and talked with me. And said, I've come to give you skill and understanding. Amazing. You know, Daniel was instrumental in God's people going back to build the walls of Jerusalem. That's very important. Very important. His intercession allowed God to bring the people back. Although God had prophesied it, he needed for a man to stand in the gap, and Daniel was the man. I can't go into it. I've taught on it in the Babylon series. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed to Daniel. So you get revelation when you've denied yourself, taken up your cross. And I was mourning 3 full weeks. So there again he's living this lifestyle. I ate no pleasant bread, neither flesh nor wine in my mouth. Neither did I anoint myself till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. And a man came to him. And what does he say? Verse 12. Fear not, Daniel. For from the first day thou set thine heart to understand and chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard. God heard you as from the first day. But he was fasting 3 full weeks. What was he praying for? What was his supplication for? He had the revelation that it was time for God's people to go back. And Daniel's prayers of intercession were pivotal in Israel, fulfilling God's plan and going back to Israel. The devil wanted to keep them in Babylon. That's what he does. He tricks Christians to get into Babylon, into the counterfeit, the prosperity gospel or whatever. They're all counterfeit. It's not the true gospel of Christ at all. He gets them into that. And what he does, when God puts you in Babylon because you don't want the truth, the devil's job is to keep you there and let you die in Babylon. But God only puts you in Babylon to get you in a mess, to get you out and get you back again. God only allows you to go in the pigsty so you come back to your Father's house. That's why people are in Babylon. We don't despise them. They're there till they come to the senses. And when Babylon falls, they'll all know. And God gave him revelation and wonderful things. But isn't that a marvellous testimony? He denied himself. He took up his cross and followed him. He destroyed the works of the devil. He undid what the devil had did, tricking them to get into Babylon. And his prayer got them out again. So it works. If you deny yourself, take up your cross, God will commission you. He'll listen to you. He'll commission you. He sent Gabriel. All right, I'm not a Moses. Doesn't mean that I will deliver Great Britain. I'm not a Daniel. It doesn't mean that my prayer will mean the restoration of Israel. But in measure, as God's called me, I should have an effect pro rata to those three things. Don't sell yourself short. Don't say you're not a Moses. I know you're not. There's only a Moses once every 4,000 years, so you'll not be a Moses. You won't be a John Wesley. You only get a John Wesley every 200 or 300 years. But you can be an important cog in the machinery. You can play your part and see signs and wonders in your life. And God can commission you to do wonderful things. The whole world may not know about it, but some people will. And lastly, Jesus. Fancy Jesus having to go through the process of denying himself and taking up his cross before he destroyed the works of the devil. Have you ever wondered why Jesus went down to Egypt? He was born in Bethlehem. But God arranged it because his life was under threat, and like Moses he had to flee to Egypt. So Jesus had to go to Egypt. Fancy Jesus coming under Egypt, the world, under Pharaoh. Jesus came under Pharaoh. Don't you think that's amazing? You can't be called out if you're not in. You've all got to be in to get called out. At the end of Revelation it says, come out of her, my people. Babylon, my people. So his people are in Babylon. If you're not in, you can't come out. So he didn't say, come out you sinners, you worldly. Come out of her, my people. God's people have been tricked to be in Babylon. And that's part of my job, to warn people and say, get out before Babylon falls. But God's people were in Babylon. And so Jesus was in Egypt. Matthew chapter 2. I'll read verse 14. I'm just picking up the story where he fled. When he arose, this is Joseph after his dream. When he arose, he took the young child, that's Jesus, and his mother by night and departed into Egypt. The wise men didn't come at the birth of Jesus. I don't know where that came from. That's some religious nonsense. After the wise men had gone, he took the young child. It said the child was there. I reckon it was probably 2 years later when the wise man came. God used it. And he was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. Do you know which prophet that was? It was Hosea. And Hosea was talking about Israel. Out of Egypt have I called my son. He's talking about Israel, but he's not. He's also talking about Jesus, but Hosea didn't know. So therefore God knew that Jesus would have to go to Egypt. God knew that he would have to call his own son out of Egypt. Don't you think that's significant? Because Jesus is our example. He said he's a good high priest because he suffered like us. Therefore he can succour those that are tempted. Because Jesus has been through it. He's been in the world. He's been in Egypt. He's been called out. He's showing us. He was baptised in water and he'd never sinned. But John's baptism was for the repentance of sins. And John said, you should be baptising me. You're sinless, the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world. And Jesus says, yes, I know. But do it to fulfill all righteousness. Do it because that's right. I've come out of the world. I'm in Adam's flesh. I've never sinned, but baptise me. And so Jesus is our example. He's been through things to help us. Out of Egypt have I called my son. So Jesus has come out of Egypt. But when he came out of Egypt, he didn't start preaching. He was only a young lad, just knee height when he came out of Egypt. But he grew up. When he was 12, we know he was in Israel. He went to the temple. Said, I must be about my father's business. And from that age, let's say he was 3 or 4, I don't know, up to 30, that's 20 odd years, he was silent. Never preached, never cast devils out. Why? Because God was dealing with him. And as soon as he was baptised, Jesus went into the desert to be tempted of the devil. How long was he tempted? There's the number, 40 days. So it took Moses 40 years to get Egypt out of him. It only took Jesus 40 days. He was tested in all points as we are. When the devil said, turn the stones into bread, when the devil said, jump off the pinnacle, when the devil said, you can have all the world, you can rule the world for me and be Antichrist, and all the kingdoms of the world can be yours, Jesus wanted it. He wanted to turn stones into bread. You're not tempted at things you don't want. If you didn't want it, it's no temptation. I've never been tempted to have a cigarette because I don't want them. I've never smoked, so it's not a temptation. You can't be tempted in what you don't want. So Jesus was tempted, therefore he had to deny himself. He had to not do what he wanted. And so it's 40 days in the wilderness being tempted of the devil, crucifying the flesh, getting rid of his will. Amazing, isn't it? And then what happened? After he'd come out of Egypt, after he'd had all those years and then tempted in the wilderness, crucifying his flesh, he destroyed the works of the devil. Let me end up with how I started, because Jesus is our last example. Luke chapter 4. The Spirit of the Lord, it says in one version, is now upon me. It wasn't upon me before. Now I'm anointed. I was a carpenter before, but now I'm anointed. The Holy Ghost has come upon me like a dove. Now I'm anointed to preach the gospel. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, preach deliverance to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to destroy the works of the devil. And when they looked at him strangely, because he closed the book halfway through a sentence, he said, this day, the scripture's fulfilled in your ears. I'm here. I've come to set you free. They didn't believe it. They crucified him. God's people never want the real Jesus. So let me come to a conclusion. We need to deny self. That's being different than the world. We need to take up our cross. That's to go through the process. It's a long process to crucify the flesh. And then following Jesus, destroying the works of the devil, being effective in ministry, is a natural consequence. You see, the devil doesn't fear power, contrary to what many Christians think. The devil's got plenty of power. The devil's got the world in a mess. He's not frightened of power. Satan's the god of this world. The people at the top in this world, whether they're royalty or presidents, they're serving Satan. Don't be deceived. They know it at the very top. They know who they're serving. They have satanic rituals, like all kings do, like all. They're not godly people. That's for us. Because Satan's the god of this world. You don't get to the top. Satan said, I can give it to who I want to Jesus. And Jesus didn't correct him. The devil doesn't fear power. I'll tell you what he fears. He fears holiness. People who are different. People who he's got no hooks in. He fears people he cannot control. That's why this system is about control. That's why the one world order is all about control, so you're not free, so they've got tabs on you. They fear the one world system, fear people who are not part of the system. And because Satan's the God of this world, he fears people who are free. If you're worldly, he's no fear, he can trip you up any time. But he fears people who are wholly separate. When the demons in people saw Jesus walking by, what did they say? They said, we know who you are. They didn't say the powerful one, the mighty anointed one. They said, the Holy One of Israel. We know who you are, the Holy One. They cowered back. Satan fears holiness, separation, not power. Don't major on power. The gifts of the Spirit are wonderful. But if you haven't got the fruit of the Spirit, you'll do damage. And Satan will use the very gifts God's given you to build a whore, to build Babylon. You need the character. It's no point casting devils out if I'm covetous and after people's money. It's no point being a great preacher if it gives me pride and status. Paul said, we're the offscourings of the earth. It's the wrong spirit. And the devil can trip you up any time you want. You've got to go through the process. So I've finished. The world needs leaving, denying self. The flesh needs crucifying, taking up your cross. And following Jesus, automatic consequences. I believe if you'll go through these teachings, because I've seen so many people change. I've changed myself. My wife is a testimony to the change that can come about. If you'll go through these teachings, I believe God will commission you. I believe that you'll have a relationship with God that you never had before. I'm convinced of it if you'll go through them and practice it. I've got too many testimonies not to be confident now. Years ago that I couldn't say this, but I've been preaching this 50 years. And so I've got testimonies and lives that have changed, and people in the ministry because they've been through not my teaching but the teachings of Jesus. This is just my introduction. It's the teachings of Jesus that will change you. So I'll finish there. Next study. We're still in Module 1. We start 3 little studies. Very informative, very helpful, I believe, very practical. 2 natures, all in the mind, and cause and effect. I think these are necessary to understand before you go through the Sermon on the Mount. It'll put a good foundation. It'll give you an understanding of the process that you'll go through. If there's any 3 studies that I'd like people to not miss, it'd be the next 3. Anyway, we've finished. Have a wonderful week. God bless you. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all for the next study. God bless.